good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. The first is that this session will be available to be translated to English, French, and Spanish. If you'd like to access the translation, you should see the buttons to the right of your screen. If you go into translation mode, though, just note that you need to turn the volume down on the initial session so that you only get the translation audio. The second thing is that we will have a chat during this session. You're able to access the chat on the bottom right of your screen. And we encourage you to sign in with your social media accounts, with your email address, so that you can participate in the chat. We will have multiple options for Q&A and discussion during this session, and we'd love to have your active participation there. The third is that after this session, there will be a survey at the bottom of your screen. So after the session, please scroll down and fill out the survey. And without further ado, we will now move into the session. I'd like to present Koen Verbist from UNESCO to introduce our session. Koen?
Thank you so much. And yes, as mentioned, my name is Koen Verbist, and I'm a program specialist from the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa, based in Harare, Zimbabwe. I'm just going to move my screen away so I can see. Okay. I would like to welcome you all to this 1 hour session on climate risk informed decision analysis, or CRIDA. And in particular, I would like to thank the organizers, UN Habitat and the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, or AGWA, for setting up this session. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few days before the 26th COP will start in Glasgow, I don't have to remind you that climate change is starting to affect our livelihoods directly. But it's also clear that most people will be affected by climate change through dwindling water resources and negative impacts on water quality. Beyond the urgent need to address climate change mitigation, which is clear, adaptation is another challenge that we need to confront. Adaptation is about making long-term decisions under huge uncertainty and using imperfect and even contradicting data and information. And that information is often only available at very large spatial and temporal scales, for example, for hundreds of kilometers, or only provide insights in long-term trends. And it may be often difficult to really translate that to the local level where adaptation must be targeted. And to address some of those challenges, UNESCO has endorsed an approach in 2018 to address uncertainty in water resources planning, which we call climate risk informed decision analysis, or CRIDA, and which combines expertise from Deltares, the US Army Corps of Engineers, and the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, among others. So CRIDA provides you a 5-step framework that starts from the bottom up, engaging local stakeholders from the first step onwards. And this really ensures that the adaptation options are explored with the community and are aligned with local socio-cultural practices. CRIDA has been around for a few years now, and several relevant case studies are emerging worldwide. And today we'll go deeper into a few case studies that have particular importance to water and sanitation applications, and which we think should fit well in this GWOPA session. Please also note that this session is only a first, very, let's say, introductory part to CRIDA, and many more resources are available online. In particularly, we have been running online training courses on CRIDA, demonstrating further case studies in providing hands-on training. A next cycle will start in March 2020, so it is also an opportunity for those interested in following this self-paced course. And I will give more details at the end of this session. We're also hosting a global conference on bottom-up climate resilient water management approaches that starts tomorrow, and which will also cover CRIDA as well as other approaches. I will also provide information later on in the chat and in the end of this session. I really look forward to this session and to hear from you all during the Q&A what particularly challenges you may face, and also have a short discussion on how CRIDA may be useful to address these as well. I wish you all a fruitful session. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Koen. So after that introduction, we will now go into introducing CRIDA, the Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Guillermo Mendoza from the US Army Corps of Engineers, who will provide an introduction to CRIDA. Guillermo?
Hi, hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. So I'm Guillermo Mendoza. I'm with the US Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm going to give you a very high-level view of CRIDA. And as Koen mentioned, there are many resources and opportunities to learn deeper. I can't see the screen, Kari. Share screen. There you go. Okay, next slide. All right, so most of you should be familiar with climate models, and climate models are some of the best science we have out there. They are remarkable things, great assumptions, and it's perhaps the only tool we have out there to project the future. And this is an example of I guess general circulation model. It's from France and showing um, some aspects of future climate projected in Africa. And they're remarkable technology, remarkable tools. But next slide. But they disagree with one another. On the left side, we have, this is last from Stefan Hallegate from the World Bank, and we have very opposite futures by an Australian and a French model. And, they're both great models. Next slide. And we have lots of models, a lot of good technology out there that provides different projections of the future. And as a planner, as an engineer, as an economist, you have to pick one, right? Or one or two or three. Which do you pick? Next slide. And we have many climate policies, socioeconomic future trends, and there behold is a significant bottleneck in decision making, because at the end of the day, one has to plan for a future. So we have to choose a future, and another problem we have is right at the front, the problem definition has been defined by the climate scientist, right? Which is not typically how a planning study works. A planning study is about performance, like Kuhn mentioned. It's about livelihoods. It's about resilient food production. It's about reducing shortfalls in water. It is not about temperature change. So right away, we're starting to mismatch a planning process to a stressor. So how do we bring back things together? Another third problem we have with starting from the climate side is that the planning is aligned to whatever you downscale. Whatever the variables you can downscale effectively is what you tend to plan for, which is not necessarily what you need to do. And finally, at the end state, you have to justify, at least for the financing of the project, the discounted cash flow analysis, which is the discounted benefit and costs, right? And if you do that, if you compare different alternatives to different futures, it is inherently biased to a least robust solution. So you've done a whole bunch of work. You may have done your analysis for low, medium, high, and you will be biased to least robust solution. And then there are other problems in decision making. I want to point your attention to this chart here showing fitting data to two probability curves from the UK and from the United States, and you can have the same data giving you a different probability storm, right? So an event that yields 25,000 cubic feet per second in the US would be analyzed as a 100-year return period storm, and in the UK would be a 50-year return period storm. So right away, you can see that there are a lot of problems in decision making that we need to understand the end state before we move forward. Next slide. So in 2011, a really fundamental workshop was held at the World Bank, hosted with Agua, and at that workshop, a lead engineer, Luis Garcia, opened a session and said, because of climate change, the World Bank hires a contractor to assess climate change impacts, and after paying the contractor a hefty fee, you come up with an answer that the future is uncertain, and it's not very helpful. And so it was a 3-day session, and we came to an agreement that we needed to change the way we think about climate change planning. And what came out of that was the idea of this bottom-up approaches to dealing with climate change. And this is what CRIDA is. It's a bottom-up approach. It's part of a community which kind of Agua is where we all fall under Agua. And the center pyramid there really illustrates a fundamental problem. It comes from Wilby and Desai, showing how when you start from a climate model, what you're doing right away is leading to what they call the cascade of uncertainty. There's uncertainty in the future, what the future society will look like. Then that leads to future more uncertainty in what the emissions will look like, uncertainty from the climate model outputs, what they look like. When they're downscaled, you get even more uncertainty. And then you put into hydrology model, you get, or a hydraulic model, you get even more uncertainty, and so forth. You can see the problem. And as a decision maker, you need to provide an answer, not an uncertainty. Next slide. So what is bottom up, top down? So the left side, we have the top down approach, which is a climate driven approach, which is still very mainstream, but the idea is you downscale climate futures, you generate water supply time series, and you run it through your hydraulic systems model and see whether the system is vulnerable or not, and that's what you call your tested vulnerability domain. In the bottom up approach, you're using the same tools, but you're thinking about it differently. You ask the stakeholders. It's a collaborative process. What keeps you awake at night? What are your failure points? And that is important because stakeholders know failure, right? And once you know that, then you can bring it into your analysis, your hydrology, your systems models, and stress test it. You can find out all the ways it breaks, and then you can ask the climate scientists and other scientists, how plausible is failure? And you build your analysis that way. You build it backwards and up, and that is a more systematic approach of how engineers, economists, planners have done planning in the past. Next slide. So this community of bottom-up approach is, I think, one of the first texts that came out of it was this. On the left side is of the World Bank's decision tree framework, and this is probably the first product that came out of that 2011 workshop of the World Bank. It follows this procedure, the bottom-up procedure, and it's really about you have a client coming up with a project, and you follow it up to see whether the project is climate resilient, or program or activity, or what have you, and you adjust it to make it so. Shortly thereafter, CRIDA came out. It comes from that. It complements that document, the World Bank's document, but it adds the planning element to it. It is lined with standard planning steps, from problem statement to justification. It is more prescriptive, but it added to that framework. And that was kind of probably another important document launched in Paris in 2018, published by UNESCO IHP. And most recently, I think this is an important document. It's a World Bank resilience rating system. I just want to point out to you that CRIDA there is one of the top ways of getting an A+ on a project. But it's an interesting document. It kind of lays out different tools to thinking about getting an A rating for resilience. Next slide. So what is CRIDA? So basically, it is a bottom-up approach. It is performance-driven, not climate-driven. That means that the planning is around failure, understanding failure and trying to mitigate it, because we need to understand that data will be imperfect, and we need to be able to, from that imperfect data, we need to be able to tell decision makers whether planning as usual, is planning as business as usual the way to go, or do we need to be robust, or do we need to be adaptable, or a combination of both? And we need to have a systematic way of doing that, which is what CRIDA does. And it's the decision scales, which means that your level of analysis that you have, your technical analysis, is framed to the problem statement, right? So it is not about building a high-end tool and then thinking about what the problem statement is later. It is, what is the problem statement? And once you know the level of analysis, you build with that. CRIDA helps you generate plans that mitigate against the future, unknown scenarios, in a way that you don't need to predict the future. You use future predictions in 4 ways in CRIDA: projections, trends, theory, and sensitivity analysis to determine how plausible failure is. But it's an evidence-based approach. It works around vulnerabilities to potential futures that you are worried about. And finally, it is really a collaborative framework for risk-informed decision-making. Because at the end of the day, every society, every water utility has a different risk tolerance, and you need to work with that. At the end of the day, the decision is about how tolerant a given system is to risk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Guillermo, for that introduction. We will now have a few minutes for discussion. I'd welcome everyone to put their questions in the chat, and we can answer some of those now. But just to kick this off, Guillermo, in your last slide, you mentioned vulnerabilities. Can you give some examples of vulnerabilities?
Sure thing. So I'll give you an example of some work we did in Thailand, because I think Mark has a great one from his Islanda Zambia work. So when we worked in Thailand, in the city of Udon Thani, they have a reservoir, a single principal reservoir that provides drinking water. It provides flood risk reduction. It provides eco flows and irrigation water. So I met with we met with the operator, asked a question: what keeps you awake at night? And he says, look, we get a call from Bangkok every few years, right? And because of some storm front coming forward, and we have to release water. And more often, we start the dry season with low levels in reservoir. And one day we're going to start with not enough water to supply all our needs. That keeps me awake at night. So now I see what keeps them awake at night. Now I can put together a model, and I can model every way that it will get there. I can put combination of stressors, combinations of temperature change and population demand. I can put I can model it many times over and over again. I stress test it, and I find all the vulnerabilities, all the combinations of stressors that lead to failure, and I present that to the mayor, and it becomes a very easy discussion. So, for example, this is hypothetical, but I forget the numbers, but I will go to the mayor and say, look, Mr. Mayor and the public works director, your system will fail, or will have chronic failure if temperature increases on average 4 degrees centigrade. And the mayor will say, well, that's a big temperature change. That's beyond my, I'm not sure that's I should worry about that too much. I said, well, how about this, sir? How about population growing, 4 times? Oh, I don't think that's gonna happen either. Okay. Or how about this scenario? How about 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature and 2 times more people? Oh, that worries me. That I have the Beltway Road Initiative. My city's growing, and I believe temperatures will, and I can ask scientists how many of the climate models say that 1.5 degrees centigrade is likely or plausible in the next 50 years. So this is how we build vulnerability assessments, by having these discussions, and they're about risk, and they're about um, informing the main stakeholders, how their fears are met.
No, that's super interesting and helpful. And as Guillermo mentioned, later in the session, we'll hear about two case studies that are both addressing different problems and very relevant to water operators. One thing that's also come up during your presentation is that you mentioned that CRIDA requires some various technical capacities, such as stress testing, such as hydrologic models. I was wondering if you could discuss what's needed, and then also how and if CRIDA can be used without those, quote unquote, high tech capacities.
Okay, so first of all, the stress test really is, when we say stress test, really is modeling something many times over and over. So it is not necessarily that high tech. So on the one hand, we have, Marco mentioned the Zambia case study, which was all done in Excel. So that was done in Excel. So that was the level of technology we needed. On the other hand, we have a California case study in the Tuolumne that was very sophisticated. So the level of technology is depends on your system. And in my agency, that's very important, that we cannot add more requirements to the folks who are already overworked in the districts. So all these tools in CRIDA are things you would do anyway, right? You still have to build a hydrology model if you're doing a hydrology study. You still have, if you're doing a flood study, you still have to do a hydraulics model. If you're doing a water utility study, you still have to do your systems model. However, now your second question about doing it without a model, without tools. Certainly, I think I've had this discussion with USAID on the healthcare sector. You basically your models would be uh, subject matter experts, and you could run it like a scenario planning process, right? Where you are laying out what breaks you, and then coming up with narratives of failure. So it is a process, not a tool.
That's great. Thank you, Guillermo. And as you said, we'll hear a couple of examples of this. The first of which was done all in Excel. So without further ado, we'll move on to a couple case studies. The first we'll hear is from Zambia, and the second is from the Netherlands. They are both very, very different cases, but both very relevant to water operators. So I'd like to introduce Mark DeCatch from Millennium Challenge Corporation, who will present about Zambia. Mark?
Great, thank you, Carrie. Okay, I'm pleased to present an example that walks through what Guillermo was just explaining. So I like this example because it's simple and it doesn't have to use anything more than Excel. I work for a bilateral US government funded donor, and we had a program in Zambia, and part of that program in the water sector was rehabilitating their main water treatment plant, Iolanda, for the city of Lusaka. And so this was just a complete rehab. We had not considered climate when we started design of this project. So we were getting construction when we applied CRIDA to this, and show you how easy it was to do actually. So just a little background that's important though to understand is you see Lusaka up there at the top, and then you see these red arrows. These are dams in the region, and there's the Kafue Gorge Dam is a hydropower dam, and the Kariba Dam just south of there is the major hydropower dam for this region. So they'll play into this case study a bit. And that gray line going through the Kafue Gorge is the Kafue River, where water is abstracted for this plant and then pumped 50 kilometers uphill to Lusaka. So when we ask the owners of the plant, the utility, what keeps you up at night, what is worrying you, it is the ability to provide service to that city on a 24-hour, 7 days a week basis. We know that when cities lose water, like Lusaka, or I was previously working in Dar es Salaam, the immediate and long-term impacts are quite grave. So this is what concerns them the most. When we had developed this project originally, the rehabilitated plant would operate such that there's only about a 4% chance per year of a real drastic event that would reduce or cut service. So, a 25-year event basically. So now I'll walk through the steps in this example, as I was described before. So first we start with what we already had, which was the base project. What is the investment we were already going to make? We already know that there's these shortfalls, and the project would reduce the shortfalls to something that was acceptable, and we had this benefit. This is what we would do before we would assess the impact of uncertainties like climate. But during this and getting to know Ag1 the core, it was important for us to undertake this analysis to see what else we could do, because Zambia is a drought-prone area. The climate risk is high, and already we know we are a hydropower plant, or a hydropower fed plant, so water has impact not just for availability but for its power. So we create a basic schematic of the plant and its system, which is it is reliant on water and power like I described, and both of those are reliant on climatic conditions into the future. So we need to then do analysis where we're vulnerable. So taking this and stressing it until it starts breaking, and understanding where we need to engage. So what the core did was we took 12 global climate models and 2 scenarios, each of 24, and we plotted those. And this is what came out. So I just give you a second to look at this, but what you're going to see is on the bottom is the change in precipitation over time and the shortfall. So a majority, that green line is, no change. So some of the models on the right side show that the future will get wetter, but for the large majority, we're looking at models, the trend is showing that's going to get drier and we're going to have more shortfalls. So we'll come back to this, this plot here in a second, but what I'd like to do then is talk about what we got out of that initial analysis, which is that when we're looking at water and power, water availability was not the issue. But that had been the thought in most people's minds, because seasonally, the Kafue River, because the flow drastically decreases. And so it was seen that one day it would just be there would not be enough water to abstract from the river. But turns out that's not the case, because intakes were put in quite deep, and it's in the impoundment of the dam that provides the power to the plant. So power is the issue. And the question then becomes, how do we design solutions to provide power to the plant so that it operates under these more austere conditions into the future? And mainly the power, it's a gravity-fed plant, but the power is to pump the water up into the city. So we have 2 sets of high lift pumps to bring water to the city. That was our major, it's kind of the weakest link in the system. So in order to do that, to think about our strategies, we think, what kind of strategy do we want? And this is a table we used. So on the y-axis, you can see the climate risk, and we have a high risk because Zambia is a very drought-prone country and experienced severe droughts in the last 20 or 30 years. And then along the x-axis here is the uncertainty. What I didn't say before is that we didn't have a lot of data to work with on this project, a lot of river flow data or meteorological data. So we took what we had, and the Corps then bootstrapped that data. So they extrapolated from that data to create a set that was usable in Excel to start modeling this. But since we have high uncertainty and high client risk, we're looking for solutions that can be described in this 4th quadrant, the pink one, these flexible, robust strategies. So robust in that we're creating this plant or creating alterations to this plant so it can operate in more austere event conditions in the future than we would have previously planned for. We don't know how austere, but we know a drier future than we had planned for. Inflexible in that maybe the solution isn't right now, but we had start planning for that solution. And that played out really well in this case study. So we started thinking about what type of solutions would we put into place to provide power to that plant when power wasn't available from the utility. And the first is putting generators at the pumps, those power those pumps. The second is to enter into an agreement with the power utility in order to get a dedicated circuit to that plant. So as brownouts were happening, and at the time this study was being done, there were significant brownouts in the city because that CRIDA dam was not being properly operated. And so the city, for about 2 years, every day, people would have power for 12 to 18 hours. And then the other solution we thought of was storage in the city. So when there's low demand, we would be pumping water up into more storage in the city. You can imagine that's very, very expensive. We're talking about more reservoir space and more towers, unlike these other 2. So these were the options we had thought up, but now we had to think about how severe is the situation that we want to apply these to, and then how we're going to pick the right one, basically. So going back to those climate plot, we, on the one axis, on the y-axis before, it had been kind of shortfalls, but now it's been converted through modeling to power and power outages and the impact of power. So which of these models are we going to use to help us think about that? So what we did instead was group these outputs into 3 bins or categories. Up top here are the most extreme ones that are probably the most unlikely. This middle one here are those most likely scenarios. So a drier future, a drier future with an impact on power, but not severe. Or not too severe. And then those below are those that we're actually thinking become better, which we think is quite unlikely. So we're looking at these middle scenarios where we can see that between a 0 and 2% change in precipitation has a corresponding reduction in power and increase in days of the year where we aren't providing water as expected. So the last part then is to come up with the plan. And that's done through this incremental cost analysis. So here we can see we have those likely scenarios. The way to read this, there's likely scenarios and those less likely scenarios. So on the x-axis here, we're looking at how much does it cost to actually design this robustness, and then what's the benefit along the y-axis. So we can see with what we've spent so far, the first 3 blocks below baseline, and then with a bit more, we can get quite a bit of robustness. So we can work in features that we hadn't previously planned for that are more austere or drier than we had anticipated in the original design, because we really weren't considering climate at that time. If we wanted to go much further in that solution, water storage, it would be a significant cost, and we could show for not a lot of benefit actually. So it's actually quite easy to choose working with utility to get a dedicated circuit. We in fact got 2 dedicated circuits from 2 grids to this plant, and additionally putting in pads and connections to the pumps for the generators. But they don't need to buy the generators right now. So we know that these shortfalls aren't imagined in the near future, but in the medium future. So they will have that ready to go and plug in, use when that time comes to use these diesel generators. So what I'd like you to take away from this is that we had a fantastically collaborative and participatory approach between the utility, the modeling team, the owner of the project, which was Ministry of Finance, and then and we were able to come together quickly to figure out what is it that keeps people up at night, what are those performance metrics we want to use. Like Guillermo said earlier, this was all done in Excel. It was done quite quickly. We work on very short timelines. Our projects that we fund are 5 years. So the idea that we'll take months and months to do it in some type of analysis for climate is really hard for project team members to accept. This was done in concert and simultaneously while we're doing other work. So what came out of it was easier to accept, and also easier to accept this process as a whole. And it gave us some really realistic solutions we could apply in real time. So the utility and the owners were very happy about this outcome. And so I'd like you to take away that it takes a little, in an hour you'll get a really good idea of this, but it doesn't take much longer than that to really get a good grasp of CRIDA and how effective it can be. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. It's a very interesting case, and it's also interesting to hear how it can be done quickly and without super abundant data. So thank you for sharing. I'll now pass it over to Andrew Warren from Deltaris, who will tell us about another example in the Netherlands. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Kari. So I'm going to take a slightly different track. What I'm going to be presenting today is it's not, I mean, it is a somewhat of a case study, but it's work that is still very much under progress. We've been working together with a drinking water company here in the Netherlands to develop a methodology and a toolkit for helping to improve long-term resilience in drinking water infrastructure. And the stage at which we're at the moment is very much around we've developed a prototype and proof of concept essentially. So without further ado, I'll switch to my presentation. I'm not sure if that's up for you already. I seem to have a gallery, so I don't
Yes,
quite
we
know what
can
you're
see it.
looking at.
It looks great,
All right,
Andrew.
perfect. Okay, so but what I will say about the work that we've been doing together with this drinking water company, which is called Vitens, is it applies very much the same principles and thinking that Guillermo and Mark have already been speaking of in the preceding 2 presentations. So it's still a bottom-up approach, but perhaps minus some of the climate scenarios yet. And I say yet because that will be coming in later as we move further with the project. But if I'm to give you an idea of the problem that we were dealing with, again, we were sitting down with the utility, with the drinking water company, and asking them, what keeps you awake at night? What are you worried about? And the key things that they were worried about is that they saw resiliency issues for their drinking water network, and they saw three types of risks. There were risks on the supply side, on the demand side, but then also on the network side, which is, and it's the latter that is perhaps somewhat often ignored, if you will. So on the supply side, there's things like, yes, climate change. We've spoken a lot about that already today, but there could also be pollution sources, source pollution rather. A lot of the water supply in the Netherlands is groundwater fed, and there's these large pollution clouds that are slowly moving towards the abstraction wells. You could have just simple failure, but then obviously as well, there's increased competition for those resources as the future proceeds, and environmental needs need to be met, and agricultural needs need to be met, and so on and so forth. And then on the demand side, I mean, there's population growth, there's the change in distribution of the population throughout the network, there's potential demand spikes from, perhaps, events, or, there could be also sudden demand declines if, for example, a large industrial user were to suddenly shut down in a particular area. There's these types of risks as well that they're dealing with. But then on the network side of things, the key thing that or the key risk or resiliency risk that they had identified was that they were dealing with a heterogeneous network. Parts of their network were old, parts of their network were new. The older parts of the network were typically more branch systems, whereas newer parts had been more planned, and there were loops, or they were grid-based. And it was how all these different types of networks were patched together in the form of a patchwork, without necessarily an identifiable transmission network and direct distribution networks, and so on and so forth. So how to manage resilience into the future, taking a long-term perspective, given all this uncertainty. So the issue that we were trying to deal with, or the problem statement, was how can we improve this long-term resilience? How can we do it, given that we don't want any significant supply disruptions? We want to make sure that environmental needs can be met. So that's those risks of from the competition side of competition for resources side of things. But then also we need to keep the service affordable for the customers. And the way that we approached this together with Vitens was to essentially develop a toolkit. And I mean, it has some model components, it has some scenario development components, but it's all stakeholder driven, and all been developed via a collaborative process. But within the toolkit, we take all those uncertainties that I've spoken about on the demand and the supply and the network side. We look at different we can look at different economic growth scenarios, different water price scenarios, different population change scenarios. Likewise, technological developments, water quality, climate conditions, or even service disruptions. A pipe burst, or a production site failure, or whatever that may be. Those uncertainties feed into the relevant component, whether it's a demand component, the resources component, or the distribution network component. And then the toolkit is essentially an optimization model that spits out some key strategic performance metrics. Only a very few. We just want strategic metrics that we can use to progress a strategic plan. We're not looking for detailed operations data or modeling outputs in that way. And then we also look at the capital costs involved for these different options. And then, of course, we can take interventions at different points in the toolkit. We can use demand management on the demand side. We can expand our capacity for on the resources side, and then we can reorganize our network, which is really what the key focus of the toolkit is in the distribution network component. And the key objective of the toolkit is really to explore in a bottom-up way the impacts of all the different potential modifications that you can make in the system across this range of plausible uncertainties. So looking at all the uncertainties on the demand side, on the supply side, and on the network side, how can we improve the network arrangement? Where do we need new pipes? Where do we need new production sites, and so forth, to give us the most system resilience in the face of all this uncertainty? So we're not trying to pick which uncertainty we're going to plan for, which scenario we're going to plan for, but we're going to try and plan for a broad range of all these scenarios. So again, you see these key ideas coming through again. And the key outcome of the toolkit is that we end up with essentially transition pathways, which are sequencing of the interventions that a utility can make in relation to the infrastructure or the measures they can implement, including demand management, in the face of all these uncertainties. So there's a couple of ways that this toolkit can be applied. The first is very much as a kind of a screening tool, where you can look at the arrangement of your demand nodes and your supply nodes and establish what type of networking philosophy or networking conceptual design you wish to follow. So here you see we've got five examples, ranging from something that's more isolated, a series of isolated networks, to something that is completely meshed. Now, intuitively, we would assume that a mesh network is always going to perform better, but based on and that is the case. But based on the analysis, very, very quick, rapid analysis we were able to do with the toolkit, we could establish that, hang on, you don't need a full mesh. You don't need that level of redundancy to give you the reliability or the robustness or the resilience that you might require as a water utility. Because of course a mesh network, which is this design 5, is also going to cost the most money. So there seems to be some kind of sweet spot. And again, this toolkit can be used to help identify that sweet spot, that Pareto front, given the uncertainty space that you're dealing with. The second usage is much more as this idea of transition pathways. So it's this idea of thinking, well, I've got an existing network, I've got a asset management program that I can upgrade. So every few years, I want to install or change or augment a new pipe or a new link. Perhaps I need a new production site. Where do I put it? So it's this idea of, well, given my existing network arrangement, if I could choose one of these pipes, which one do I choose? And again, that's what the toolkit can help answer that question. Similarly for production sites, if I wanted to supplement my supply, add a new production site, which one of these gives me the biggest bang for my buck against all that future uncertainty? So this is I'm going to flick through a few slides that look pretty similar to this. And this was a very, again, prototypical pilot application for a stylized part of the Dutch water supply network, where the nodes are correct. I can guarantee that they relate to real demand nodes, but the links have been modified somewhat to keep things a bit interesting for us from a conceptual design point. So this is the existing system. Don't worry too much about all the different colors and pipe thicknesses, but and line thicknesses. But safe to say that we can use, if I move on to the next one, the outputs that we're getting from the toolkit are really around this idea of, okay, against this entire future scenario ensemble, what's our robustness? How robust is our solution? And we define, or our network, and we define robustness as, well, we want to set a particular performance threshold. In this example, we went very, very conservative and said no unmet demand anywhere. And how many of those futures do we achieve that do we achieve that performance threshold? So again, we're looking at when does the system fail? So going back to what Guillermo was talking about. So if we look at our existing system, at the moment we've got a robustness of around about 90. I think it's 87 from memory. And we can also use the toolkit to help identify which of the which demand nodes are most vulnerable at present. So they are the ones located towards the top of the left-hand chart, and also which links or which pipes are presently at capacity, and they're the ones located at the bottom on the right. So you've got a criticality assessment built into the toolkit as well. So it tells you which parts of the network you need to worry about. And what happens if we don't adapt? We see that we start with, as I said, this 87% robustness. I'm just going to focus on that figure for now. But as we take a jump ahead to 25 years, we see that, yep, suddenly our robustness across the scenario ensemble starts to range anything from around about 50% all the way up to, in some scenarios we're performing better. If we go to 50, that spread gets even bigger. So again, if we start to make new infrastructure choices, and I know I'm coming up against it for times, is that we can start to see how the effect of those choices on those metrics. So here we looked at a number of fictitious portfolios. Here's the first portfolio, a new source, a few new pipes. Second portfolio, another new source and some new links, and likewise the third portfolio. And I will state that these portfolios, they're not implemented all at once, but rather they are implemented progressively as the time advances. And what I mean by that is within each portfolio. So we're looking at each portfolio in isolation, but the various links and sources that make up each portfolio, we were slowly adding them to the system as we advanced in time. And this is what we see. So for those portfolios that I just had up on the screen, we start with already a performance boost in the initial phase beyond that baseline. But then once we go ahead 10 years, we start to see, under some scenarios, the portfolios start to perform a little problematically. Might need to take some more measures. With some additional measures at that time, we look at 25 years, and again we start to see that that second portfolio is really performing quite well. The third one's, possibly questionable given that low scenario. And then finally, if we look at the 50-year horizon, which we were using as our ultimate time horizon, we get out to we get this output. There is quite some spread, but which respects the uncertainty that is present. But as a decision maker, you can look at these graphs and go, all right, if I have to choose one of these portfolios, do I pay the extra money and go for portfolio 2, which possibly reduces my uncertainty a bit and gives me a little bit more robustness or reliability in the face of these future uncertainties, or do I try and optimize it further and get something down towards portfolio 3 or the green portfolio, or even the first portfolio 1. So these are the types of questions that we can use the toolkit to answer, and the discussions that you can have with the utility operators in terms of their investment decisions. And from those outputs, you can then generate some adaptation pathways or transition pathways to transition the network from your present network to what is you would consider to be a more resilient or robust state. Evaluate them. At this stage, we're talking about them doing a mixture of quantitative evaluation and and qualitative evaluation, depending on the type of information you have available. But the key thing is, what information do we need to be able to make a decision to advance our to improve our network? That's the question we've always been trying to answer, and that's essentially everything that I've presented up until now is geared towards being able to answer those types of questions. So it's slightly different. It's not a pure CRIDA approach, what we've done here, but it uses exactly the same principles that are contained within CRIDA. So hopefully some of you out there have been able to take something from that presentation, but I look forward to the question and answer discussion session later in the session. Back to you, Carrie.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. It was very interesting to hear these two different approaches, the first from Zambia and the second from the Netherlands, and how bottom-up approaches in CRIDA can be used in both contexts. We have some time now for questions, so I encourage you to write your questions in the chat, and we can answer them as they come in. But first, just to kick it off, and then this question's for both you, Mark, and then Andrew. One thing that CRIDA is CRIDA really represents a new approach, and it's something much different than what people are doing now. So I just wondered if you both could discuss how you get buy-in for this process. How do you convince someone to do something different than what they're already doing? So Mark, would you like to answer
Sure.
first?
Yeah, I'm glad to go first. So I'll talk about the case study, but then more broadly, even where I work. In the case study, I had really fantastic partners who were also very concerned about climate. And when you laid out the alternatives, they were very eager to undertake the CRIDA process, to understand that process as a way to address this concern they had. More overly, though, as I speak to people, there's not a lot of resistance to this idea. What the resistance is changing the process as they exist already, or finding, or because it's not only they have to buy into it, but other people around have to buy into it. And just the idea of change is difficult. So there's not a logical problem bringing CRIDA in, discussing that. I think people get it. They're very happy to work on that idea. But it's how does this play into what we're doing already and how that impacted. And so that's why I work mainly on is explaining, the time and cost impacts more than anything, and how using CRIDA actually only enhances what we're doing and really takes us a little bit of time to do that. We did, our whole analysis could be done in a few weeks, and as people see that, they get more interested.
Yeah, if I'm going to follow up from what Mark's saying, I couldn't agree more. The challenge is not getting people to understand that planning for uncertainty is something that needs to occur, but it's really fitting in with the existing processes and challenging those existing processes. So, in our case, within the development of the toolkit, we had to develop essentially a simplified network optimization model. Now, there are existing tools out there that are really focused on detailed operations of hydraulic networks, such as InfoWorks, Epinet, these types of software packages, but they're far too detailed for us, and they take far too much computational time to be able to use them within this type of framework. So it's really being able to sit down with the stakeholder and again that first decision context step or problem framing step of working out what's wrong, what is the decision you're trying to make, and what are the inputs that you need to be able to make that decision. And then it's a case of trying to develop or use the most appropriate tools to answer those questions, and fitting in with the processes. But yeah, it's really challenging existing practice. Yeah, you're always going to meet with some change, but then the key thing is really just to carry everyone along in the process, which is why I can't overemphasize the collaborative nature of this of the approach, or these types of approaches.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think the collaboration piece is very important because, starting a CRIDA project and then even implementing it requires bringing in a lot of partners and a lot of people coming along on the journey. It's not just one person managing water, it's a whole community, a whole system, even people be outside of that community. So that collaboration piece is really important. I think for one last question, and I'll ask both of you again. So Mark first and then Andrew. What advice would you give someone listening who's looking to start a CRIDA project? What things should they be aware of? and how should they really move forward with this work?
First, I would say, following on this presentation, there's the book that Guillermo presented earlier on. I think it's a really great description that really helps people understand like how to consider CRIDA for the projects you're going to do and where it fits in. But then secondly, as you are starting to talk about colleagues about using CRIDA and thinking about this change process, first I would start slow and bring them along, but also help identify a senior champion where you work and get them on board. If you get a senior champion on board, that is what's really required for even these kind of changes. They will really help bring everyone else along together. So it's kind of like grassroots to get the attention, to bring it a little bit top down, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the status quo is that everyone is is mainly comfortable with scenario planning, with top down type scenario planning. So to flip that around conceptually, of course, I think people can understand that and appreciate why you would want to do that. But yeah, again, it's still, well, hang on, I know what I know how to do what I do. I get the concept, but how can I actually bed that down in practice? So yeah, the references that Mark's alluded to obviously can help with that, but yeah, the identification of a champion within who takes a particular interest and really wants to drive it. In the Vitens case, we had that individual at Vitens who was exceptionally interested and trying to drive this process through the organization. We're now at the stage of really looking at their real network and applying the toolkit in reality, if you will. And we're now up against trying to bring a wider Vitens audience along with that process. So yeah, it's again starting from scratch and trying to get everyone on the same page as to why we're doing what we're doing, the questions we're trying to answer. But from a really practical point, the key step of CRIDA and any of these bottom-up type approaches is really that first step when you're defining your objectives and when you're defining the how you're going to determine whether or not your system is failing or not. It is intuitively the first step of every policy analysis process, so everyone thinks that they can do this and thinks that they do it with every single piece of planning work that they do. But with CRIDA and other bottom-up types of approaches, it's not that it's any different, but it's more that it requires somewhat of a shift in your thinking to be thinking about the whole process going through and how the decisions that you make in terms of your objectives and the metrics that you use are going to play out further through the process. So it's you cannot put enough effort into that first step. That's what I would emphasize as well.
No, I think that's a really great point, Andrew. I mean, the first step in CRIDA really involves stakeholder engagement and starting with defining the problem and bringing in everyone. There too, really include making sure that all voices are included, not just the loudest in the room, but really making sure that those vulnerable populations are included, as well as ecosystems, livelihoods, people or things that don't also necessarily have voices as well. So thank you all for your responses. I will now pass it over to Koen to close up the session and tell you how you can get more involved with CRIDA. Koen? And you are muted. You are still muted. It should be at the bottom of your screen. You're still muted.
So yeah, maybe Carrie, maybe you should close. I think Kuhn texted.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, so CRIDA, it's a very active process. There are currently a number of case studies that are happening in pilot studies. One of which is Zimbabwe, and another in South Africa. So we encourage you to read the resources that we put in the chat, and reach out if you'd like to get involved. CRIDA, all their case studies started with people in these communities really defining the problem and seeing a need to develop climate adaptation approaches. So it starts with you. We encourage you to reach out. There's also, as Kuhn mentioned, there's a number of training courses that are happening over the next couple months. So see the links in the chat for more information there. But thank you all, and I wish you a good week. And thank you for joining. Bye.
What? Already over?
No, we have plenty more options to continue the discussions and peer exchange beyond the Congress.
Tell me more. What are the options?
Well, SHIWOPA membership, for example. By becoming a member of SHIWOPA, everyone can connect to a global alliance of practitioners and experts. There are two ways of becoming a member. First, institutional members. Institutions can participate in SHIWOPA's assemblies and are eligible to run and vote in its international steering committee elections. Or second, individual members. Individuals can connect and engage with peers in the online SHIWOPA community. We have created a space that allows for networking and easy communication. Meet future WOP partners, stay up to date on project opportunities, and participate in peer-to-peer learning opportunities.
Sounds great. How can I join?
Simply go to www.shiwopa.org and register for free. If you want to know more, you can follow SHIWOPA on social media and subscribe to the newsletter. Thanks for joining the 4th Global TOPS Congress. We'll see you soon.